Most people in their 50s are still planning for retirement the same way that they did in their 30s. And that's the number one reason they don't retire until their mid or late 60s when they could have retired potentially before age 60. So in today's video, I'm going to show you first why relying on intuition could be the difference between retiring 5 years earlier or 5 years later. Second, the traps that keep people working longer than they need to. And third, the system that we use with clients that can make retiring before 60 a reality. Let me introduce you to Jim and Karen. They're both in their early 50s, and on paper, they looked like model savers. But because they were relying on intuition, they were pouring so much of their planning energy into one conventional retirement move that turned out to be a huge mistake. I'm going to show you that mistake later in the video, and I think you're going to be quite surprised by what I show you. But first, when Jim and Karen sat down with me, they looked like they were doing everything right. They were saving diligently, had paid off their debts, they had a healthy balance in their different retirement accounts. But when I started asking them some basic questions, gaps started showing up right away. I asked them, "What age do you think you can retire?" And they told me, "Well, we know what age we want to retire at, but we actually have no idea when we can." So I asked them, "How much do you think you can safely spend each year in retirement without running out of money?" And Jim and Karen said, "Well, we know what we want to spend, but we have no idea if that's realistic or not." And here's the problem. Each of their answers was based on a hope or an assumption, and as a result, they had no idea whether the actions they were putting so much effort into were actually going to turn those hopes into a reality. So I told Jim and Karen to think of retirement like training for a marathon. When you're younger, you can run by feel, right? Just showing up and running miles is enough to build endurance. And that's kind of like saving steadily, investing, and taking advantage of employer benefits in your 30s and your 40s. But as race day and retirement day get closer, running by feel just isn't enough anymore. You need precision, you need a structured plan, and you need feedback from your training. Retirement works exactly the same way. In your 50s, the finish line is in sight. But if you're still, quote unquote, running by intuition, guessing at your retirement age, hoping that your savings will be enough, assuming that things will just work out, you are setting yourself up for a very painful race day. And this is why so many people miss their chance to retire early. It's not because they didn't save enough, but because they never shifted from an intuition-based method to a system-based method. That's how they drift into retiring at 65 or 67, when with the right system in place, they could have stepped away years earlier if they wanted to. Now, Jim and Karen were right at that crossroads. Without realizing it, they were walking straight into one of the biggest retirement traps that I see people fall into at this stage. So what was the mistake that Jim and Karen were making? Well, there were several, but first among them was that they'd been contributing big money to Roth accounts, even doing mega backdoor Roths because they'd always been told that it was the best move. Now, on the surface, that sounds smart, but when we dug deeper, two problems came up right away. First, because Jim and Karen were high income earners with significant savings already in some after-tax brokerage accounts, they were actually much better candidates for Roth conversions after they retired, rather than Roth contributions while they were working. Now, without a system in place, they had no way to evaluate that trade-off or even become aware of it. Jim just looked at me and said, "Are you telling me that all this money we've been pushing into Roths is not actually necessarily going to help us retire earlier?" And this led them to a second problem. I asked them, "Do you actually know whether these Roth contributions will benefit you while you're alive, or are they only going to be a windfall for your heirs?" And that's when the light bulb went off. I told Jim and Karen that Roth contributions are not bad. They had no system to determine whether those contributions were moving them closer to their retirement goal or whether they were just taking an action because they thought it was the smart action to take. And here's the danger. Intuition, like what Jim and Karen were doing, will always default to what feels right? Working longer feels right. Spending less feels right. And those things end up delaying your freedom. That's why so many people end up retiring at 65 or 67 when they could have probably retired years earlier. Now, what Jim and Karen needed, and what most people in their 50s need, isn't more effort or more guesswork, right? It's a system that takes your hopes and turns them into a plan that you can actually test. So let me show you exactly how that works. The first step in the system we recommended for Jim and Karen was to do a baseline test. So first thing is measure their starting point. Now, I told Jim and Karen, think of this like going to a new trainer for the first time. They're going to check your gait. They're going to watch you stride. Maybe they'll even have you do a test run so that they know exactly where you're starting from. And that way they can design your marathon training plan that gets you ready for race day. Now, it would be the same thing with retirement planning. Without a baseline, there is no way to know whether the actions that you take are actually improving or moving you closer to your desired finish line. The second step in the system is to produce spending speed limits. Once we know your starting point, the next step is to map out your pacing strategy or your personal spending speed limits. Now, for Jim and Karen, that meant establishing their retirement spending guardrails. That would be the maximum they could safely spend each year, given the amount they're saving and when they say they want to retire, and the rules for when to slow down if they start drifting off pace. And just like a marathoner needs to know their target splits to avoid burning out too early and not finishing the race, retirees need spending speed limits so that they don't run out of resources too soon. Now, here's the key. Once those speed limits are in place, we can then reverse engineer the rest of the financial plan. And that would include things like Social Security, Roth conversions, pre-Medicare health insurance, and gifting strategies. Those things are no longer random one-off decisions. They end up becoming coordinated moves designed to support or improve the spending speed limit that is possible within the plan. Step 3 in the system is to create a performance plan. And this is where you look at how hard you're pushing in your training. You don't want to overtrain and risk injury, but you also can't undertrain and expect to finish strong. For Jim and Karen, that meant making sure that their portfolio wasn't taking on more risk than necessary, but still achieving the required rate of return to fund their retirement. And conventional wisdom says that all that matters is asset allocation and your rate of return. And that would be like a runner only ever tracking their heart rate while they're training. Sure, your heart rate matters, but if you don't also monitor how your split times are going and pay attention to how your body actually feels, you'll miss a host of warning signs that tell you your body is breaking down or whether or not you're going to live up to your actual marathon goal. We gave Jim and Karen additional fitness markers for their portfolio. And these are early warning signs they could monitor to keep their plan healthy without taking on unnecessary risk. The final step in the system is to create feedback loops. Feedback loops are what tie the whole thing together. For a runner, it's those ongoing check-ins, right? It's timing your splits, tracking your recovery runs, and doing some pre-race tests to make sure that your training is paying off and going to actually build fitness. In retirement, it's the same. Too many people think they're monitoring their plan, but the only thing they really track is their rate of return or their account balance. And that's like a runner only ever checking their stopwatch while they're on training runs. We built Jim and Karen feedback loops that track their withdrawals, their spending speed limits, their portfolio health measures, so that when they eventually retire and as they lead into retirement, they would not be caught by surprise. They would always stay on pace. They would always know if they needed to adjust before it was too late. And here's the key. Once Jim and Karen saw their plan in this system, they stopped guessing. They finally knew not just what they hoped would happen, but what they could confidently expect to happen. And once Jim and Karen's plan was clear in that system, the right moves from there became clear. So here's what we ended up recommending for Jim and Karen. First, stop contributing to Roth accounts and redirect those savings into pre-tax accounts. That kept more of their money working for them now while setting them up for smarter Roth conversions later. Second, based on their savings trajectory, we showed them that they could confidently retire when Jim turned 59. Not someday, not maybe, but with a degree of certainty. And then third, between ages 59 and 62, we mapped out the opportunity for Roth conversions. Now, the exact timing and amount would be fine-tuned closer to that age, but now they had a clear window within which to think about optimizing taxes without guessing. And then finally, we recommended they claim Social Security at 65. And that was not because it maximized their lifetime dollars on paper, but because it gave them the smoothest, richest income experience during retirement. I told them that, this isn't about dying rich. It's about living rich. And here's the kicker. We reassured them that they'd still likely pass away with a pile of money to leave to their heirs or causes they cared about. The difference was they would now maximize their spending and enjoyment while alive instead of over-optimizing for a legacy they'd personally never benefit from. Jim and Karen walked away knowing exactly how to retire before 60 and with the peace of mind that every decision they were making was backed by a system and not just intuition or gut feeling. So here's the big takeaway. In your 50s, intuition just won't cut it. If you want the option to retire before 60, you need to put a system into place. A system that helps you measure exactly where you are, set clear spending speed limits, reverse engineer the key retirement decisions you're going to face, and monitor your plan with feedback loops so that you're always on track. And that's what Jim and Karen did. That's why they'll be enjoying their retirement years earlier than they ever thought they would. And so if you're in your 50s and you're still relying on your gut or your intuition, this is the time to make a change. Don't drift into your mid or late 60s when you could retire years earlier if that's what you'd like. So run a system, not your gut, and give yourself the option. And if you want to see exactly how the system works in more detail, step by step, I have a free video that walks you through the exact same 4-step process we use with all our clients. Just click the first link in the description below this video. Thank you as always for your time and attention. See you in the next video.